Hi, everyone. This talk is going to be on art direction and pipeline for Moon Studios' latest title, Ori and the Will of the Wisps. My name is Jeremy Gritton. I was the art director and story lead for the game, and I'm going to be co-presenting with my colleague Daniel Van Leeuwen, who was our lead artist. Now, because this is a remote presentation, we've split it up into two parts. I'm going to be taking the first section on our art direction and review process, and then Daniel's going to be showing you all of the cool tools and technology that we use throughout development. So before we get started talking on the art, though, let's talk about the team a little bit. And what a lot of people might not know about Will of the Wisps is that it was created with a new art team. So basically what happened was when Blind Forest was completed, all of the original artists moved on to new projects. And so Moon Studios had to reload with a new art team. And I was one of those initial hires as a part of that process. Now, we were able to meet with some of the original artists and to pick their brains a little bit, which was extremely helpful. They were really nice. They were really helpful. But it was brief. It was fairly brief. So it was a bit like somebody tossing you the keys to a nice car and saying, here you go, don't crash it. There was a little bit of pressure there because the original game had been so beautifully made and it was so well received. And we wanted to make sure that we could do it justice with the sequel. So we wanted people to feel like they were back in that familiar space, back in that world. But at the same time, we didn't want to only mimic what was done before. We wanted to make sure that we were embracing the strengths of our new artists, that we were able to leverage that, and that we were also pushing boundaries in some ways beyond things that Blind Forest had done. So it was definitely, throughout production, there was a balancing act there between making sure that we were honoring what was done before and that we were doing some new stuff and pushing the boundaries. So let's talk a little bit about how we plan an environment on a macro level. So this is a design layout of one of our environments, Bowers Reach, which is the winter environment in the game. And when we first get it, it will look something like this. Maybe even a little more plain than this because this screenshot actually has some of our art setups still enabled, so we wouldn't have those. But once we have set dressed the environment, it's going to look more like this. This isn't completely accurate in terms of the colors because it's more of a zoomed out view in our editor, and it can only load one post setting at a time. But it gives you an idea of kind of what the environment might look like when it's fully set dressed. So how do we go through that process and get from that initial state to the ending state? Well, one of the first things that we do is mind mapping. And this is a technique that was taught to me by the Blind Forest artists. They told me that basically this is what they did for every environment that they built. And I said, okay, well, if that's what you guys did, that's what we're going to do. So we always did mind mapping for our environments. And basically, we would have a big kickoff call about the environment, but before the call, I would give everyone a homework assignment, which was to do this. And so what might happen, this is just an example, is that you would say, okay, we're going to have a winter biome. What are the different ideas that we might have for what we could set dress in a winter biome? And we can split them up into natural ideas, artificial ideas. And I won't go through all of these, but for example, if we're in a winter environment, well, snow and ice is probably going to be there. We might have things like ice blockades, frozen waterfalls, diggable snow, icy stalactites or stalagmites for hazards, frozen lakes. Or we could have an example like this, Thule's abandoned home. We knew that we had this NPC named Thule, who was a gardener character, who was originally from Bowers Reach. And so we thought, well, if Thule left their home behind, then maybe we can visit their abandoned garden, and maybe in the garden we can find an ancestral tree. And that would be kind of a cool environmental storytelling setup around that key interactable, the ancestral tree. And you do this for like all kinds of things, and everybody's a lot of the ideas will overlap, but sometimes people will have ideas that nobody else had, and that's great because we pull that into that collective web, and we just gather as many ideas as we can. Now, as we're doing this, we're also gathering references, and I don't have a slide to show references because I wasn't sure if it's okay to show images that we've just collected off of Google or Pinterest or wherever. But people are usually gathering references along with these ideas. And I can't stress enough how important references are. You always want to be gathering as many references as you can whenever you're taking on an artistic task. So let's go ahead and go to the next step. Splitting the environment into sub-themes. So once we've gathered all of our ideas, we've done the mind mapping, we've gathered a bunch of references, we've had the kickoff call to discuss things. we're going to talk about how can we break the space up into subsections. And these are really useful because even if an environment, even if the artwork is beautiful and it's beautifully dressed, if everything is the same, the player is going to get a lot of visual fatigue from it. And also, it's going to be harder to orient yourself within the space. But if you're able to carve out different portions of it and give them their own kind of unique signatures, that's going to give the player some visual variety. It's going to be constantly throwing new twists and things to the player, which is interesting. It keeps people engaged, and it's also going to help people orient themselves. It's going to give them a sense of space because they'll say, "Oh, I'm in the ice caverns. Okay, yeah, I remember the forest was to the left, and then the cliffs were above." Something like that. And you can see here how we planned out this space, splitting things up with a warmly lit forest, Thule's home for environmental storytelling, ice caverns, a transitional sunset portion here going up the cliffs, and then the mountaintop at night with the aurora borealis. And I remember that this was actually a big point of discussion on the team. Was it okay to do a time of day change based on location where, okay, everything's daytime here in the sun, and then when we go up, we're getting these deep colors with sunsets, these really robust colors. And then up here, it's going to be night. And then if I come back down, I'm going to have sunset again and then day again at the bottom. And it was debated for a bit on the team. And I think ultimately we decided, you know what, let's not overthink this. This is giving us a lot of nice colors and nice visual variety to the space. And we don't think the players are really going to mind that we're playing with time of day based on location. And I think that ultimately that was the right choice. So at this point, we're also going to be doing concept art for the location. And that can be happening earlier, and it can also be happening later. It's kind of continuous throughout the process. But I grabbed a few examples just to talk about them. And I remember this one on top left very specifically, because this was one of the earliest concept arts that we had. And this one was a real inspiration to me because I remember thinking, wow, this is such a cool idea. I love this juxtaposition between a cold environment and warm light. And I felt that was something that was so unique. It was such a unique look to the cold environment in Blind Forest with Forlorn Ruins, where everything is very blue. And so this was our version on a cold environment. And I always had felt like if we were going to do something that was similar to Blind Forest in that way, we had to have our own unique spin on it. And I felt that this really had captured that. And then this was another painting that another artist had done that was also similar in that type of mood and that type of approach. And so I remember I was always circling back to these two paintings and kind of pointing them out to the art team and saying, I really want us to do something like this in Bars Reach. Like, this is really cool to me. And the final look of the environment, it is a little different than this, but these were absolutely the inspiration for that approach. And then this one on top right, I remember one of our artists did this, and I thought, oh, this is great. This really sells me on the idea of ice caverns. I think the colors maybe are a little bit different than where we ended up in the final game, but I do remember this being definitely an inspiration for us, and pretty much made me settle on, yes, we absolutely have to have a sub-theme of ice caverns. And then this one at the bottom, when I was working on the script, I'd had this idea for this sort of like a cherry blossom tree on the mountain peak. And it would be at night with the aurora borealis behind, and that everything would feel very magical, and that this is where Ori would go to collect one of the wisps, which would be the memory of the forest. But I didn't really have any sketches for any of this. It was more like the notes that I had jotted down for the moment that we wanted to have. And so I remember one of our artists had taken that, and so she painted this, and when she showed it to me, I just thought, oh, that is it. That is perfect. And if we can just get this into the engine, I will be ecstatic. And that's basically exactly what happened. When you play the game, it almost looks exactly like this. And so I couldn't be happier with how this one turned out. She really did a great job. Let's go to the next slide. So at this point, we're getting a pretty good feel for what we want to do. And so one of the things that we do is we take that design layout and we do a color script over top of it. And this is sort of where we're blocking out, based on the sub-themes that we're going to break things up into, let's do a painting and kind of get those color themes in there and get a real feel for how we might transition through the space. And so something that you might notice from this, which is interesting, is that the layout is completely different. And That's because when you're working in production, everything's a moving target. And so this was from an early iteration that design had done. And then later they really shifted things around and a lot of stuff got shuffled around. And that's okay because this really gave us a lot of confidence that we had the right approach. And so even though things kind of moved around, we still retained these 4 sub-themes essentially. And I think that it worked out successfully. So let's go to the next one. At this point, we're feeling pretty good about our plans. And so we're going to go into asset construction. And so typically what happens is we have a budget for the amount of assets that we can create for an environment and what kind of roles that they will have in the environment and what resolution that they can be. And so artists will get an assignment that might be something like painting assets for the ice caverns. And it might be something like you can paint 4 ground layers or ground tiles, 4 ceiling tiles, 5 hazard tiles, 4 corner tiles, something like that. And so the way that we do it is one artist will be painting the tiles. And what we do is we say, don't paint them all the way till final. Paint them to maybe about half completion. Let's keep them a little bit rough. Because then as those tiles are at a halfway state, we pass them to another artist who starts doing test set dressing with the tiles and just seeing how they work. And so we do a series of test scenes. These aren't even based on the real game or anything like that. It's just purely for experimentation. And so these scenes are allowing us to test the tiles, how they blend together, how useful they are, and then also to test different colors and post settings. So the artist who's doing the set dressing will typically be giving feedback on the tiles. And so they might say something like, this batch of tiles, these are really great. These are really useful. I use them all the time. This batch of tiles, I don't really use them. I'm not really finding them useful at all. And then also I'm noticing that I really wish that I had tiles for different roles or different reasons that I think are missing, tiles X, Y, and Z. And so what happens is based on that feedback, the tiles that aren't useful, we kind of just throw them out. And then we reallocate that budget to the tiles that basically have been called out as being missing. And then at that point, if we have a high degree of confidence that, yes, this is all going to work, we allow the artist painting the tiles to go through and to really polish them up and refine them and get them looking really good. So that's basically how that works. Now, we've talked a little bit about how we plan out an environment on a macro level. Let's talk a little about how we critique scenes and how we approach scenes individually. So for me, I was a big fan of Blind Forest and loved the game. I played through it. That's kind of how I ended up at Moon Studios. But it was extremely important after I was hired to study the original game. I had to really go through it and to really deconstruct it. And so people will ask me sometimes, what was the primary inspiration or what was the primary reference when working on Will of the Wisps? And I always tell them it was Blind Forest. And I know that might sound like a little bit of a boring answer, but we didn't work on that game. And it was this amazing reference, this amazing resource that we could look to. And I can't overstate how beneficial that was for me. This was my first time directing, to have something like that, to have a template that I could look to, and to constantly be sort of like a guiding light, essentially, as we were working through the game. So it was kind of a balance. We wanted to look at Blind Forest and to really see what was really useful and what techniques and tricks were they using in the game that were really good. And then also just evaluating the work that we were doing and saying, okay, what are the mistakes that we're making and what can we do to avoid those mistakes? So a lot of it was really about discovering patterns in the work in both directions, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. What really happened was, as I was gathering all of this information, all of the do's and don'ts, I was kind of taking notes on everything, and I was gathering references for myself. And this ended up growing into something that I called the set dressing checklist. And it probably looks like a lot. There's a lot of text here on the screen, but it's really not that bad. So if you look here on the top left, under the technical header, this is really just all the basics. These are the things that you just have to do in production. Things like naming your files correctly, organizing them correctly, making sure that your scene is something that anyone can open up and they're not going to be lost. Making sure that if someone tries to play your scene, that it is playable, that Ori isn't just falling into the abyss forever, just all this kind of little stuff. We won't go into too much detail on this. And then readability, this is obviously very important. You want to make sure that the player can understand the space that they're navigating, that when they look at it, it's very clear these are the collider elements that I can jump and run on, and these are the hazards that I want to avoid, and this stuff is just kind of the set dressing in the background. It's just window dressing for aesthetic purposes. Here under visual, this is really about the translation of a scene from that block out to a fully set dress scene. So kind of what we had shown earlier in Bowers Reach, what are some of the techniques that we can think about for how to break things up and to contextualize them in a visually interesting way, while still allowing it to play the same. And then the effects, this is really just polish. This is just, okay, the scene looks good, we're really happy with it. What are the little particle effects and little things that we can add to beautify the scene? So let's talk a little bit about colors. And I think that Inkwater Marsh is a good example of that. So one of the things that we do sometimes is we use color to create separation between the plates. So here you'll see the center layer is predominantly green, and then the background layer is predominantly blue. So there's a very clear visual distinction between the two layers, which helps make it easily readable for the player. But one thing that's nice is, even though these are very distinctive from one another, the scene still feels harmonious because on the color wheel, these are analogous colors. And so because they're right next to each other on the color wheel, the scene still feels cohesive. And then what's interesting about Inkwater Marsh is it's one of the only environments that we have that has a time of day change. And so later in the game, you can explore it in the daytime. And what you'll see here is that the mood is drastically different because we've switched now from blue-green to green-yellow, but it's still analogous colors. So the center layer has remained green. It's gone from cool greens into warm greens, and it's the background layer that has dramatically changed, going all the way from blue all the way till yellow. But even though this is a dramatic shift, it still feels harmonious as a whole. Now, we can also use colors not just for separating the different plates for gameplay, but we can also use it to provide contextualization to the player. So Silent Woods is a good example of a monochromatic scene. It's essentially just blue. But we had this idea in art to really play up the idea of fires in a certain portion of it. And so what we did was we created a subsection similar to what we talked about in Bowers Reach. And that would give a unique quality to this portion. And we tied it into a unique gameplay element in this section, which was these updrafts that Ori could glide against. So basically, the way that it works is that anytime that the player has this gliding gameplay, they also get this unique color signature that lets them know they're able to traverse the environment in a different way than usual. And so that's actually quite useful. Now, we can also use value and contrast to create separation between the background and the center layer. And it's pretty straightforward. Typically, in the center layer, that's where you'll see your highest degree of contrast. So we'll have our darkest darks and our brightest brights. And then in the background, we really clamp the values. So you're going to get more gray tones. And so that value separation combined with DOF that creates a little bit of blur in the background, that's really going to push the two layers apart. And that's actually quite useful for us. And here you can see another example of just value separation between the layers. The water here is getting so murky. It's very reduced in terms of contrast relative to the center layer. And then here again, you can see how the background is much more reduced in contrast relative to the center. And these brambles, the spikes on them, are very bright, and that's really to help them stand out. And we used to study our scenes all the time like this. We used to have filters on our monitors that we could just toggle to black and white, and we were always checking the values of our scenes. So let's talk a little bit about what the process is like when reviewing scenes and how we develop them. And I think that this is a good example. This is for Meeting Talk. This is a first pass set dressing. It's very old. And if you're familiar with the game, you might be wondering, why are the colors so different? We didn't have the day-night state really working at this time, so everything was dressed in more of a neutral state. But setting that aside, let's talk about the set dressing just in and of itself. So one of the things that we would run into early on was staying too close to the solids. And it started to feel almost like assets were kind of pasted in a way where they were filling in the solids, but we weren't really recontextualizing things, and we weren't taking as many artistic liberties as we could. So what I used to do a lot of the time is I would do really quick scribble sketches on top of things, sometimes even on a call while I'm talking to the artist and we're chatting about stuff. And they're not really meant to be beautiful to look at or anything like that, but it's really more to convey intentions and to convey what are the types of things that we can do with this space to break it up. So let's take a look at one of those, because I dug up a few of these old scribbles. So this was just a few quick suggestions that I had made to the artist for this space. Let's just talk through them. So one of them was, here on the ground, we can really break this up. We can break it up in terms of material and in terms of negative space. So you can see here, this ground portion, maybe we can have a giant root or fallen tree trunk or something like that here to break things up. And that can provide us with a negative space underneath, which is also nice because it can let us play with the silhouette, and maybe we can have little hanging bits of moss that animate and so on. And then here in the foreground, maybe we can really play up the foreground elements more to get more distinctive silhouettes and really push that layering and get more parallax into the scene. And then over here, we have this really big, heavy element that was added by design as a blocker. And we would see this quite often. And so one of the tricks that we would do is we would create these close background elements that would support it. So that it doesn't feel too much like it's suspended in air. So anytime you have something really heavy like this, you want to have some kind of support structure behind it. And that gives us a lot of opportunities in terms of silhouette and just doing lots of little, creating natural shapes and so on. And then we can also lighten there's just that sense of mass of that object by adding another negative space up here, and then adding little plants and things to animate and so on. And then over here, we have this, there was this big rocky piece, and we could break this up as well in terms of material and negative space. It's actually very similar to this section by making the stone part smaller and then adding some wooden posts. That gives us some more negative space and layering over here. And then as an added bonus, when Ori jumps against it, we're going to get some physical reactivity, and that's always nice. So let's take a look at the final. And so this is the scene that we ended up shipping, and as you can see, I think it looks much better. But what's really interesting about this is that you can see how so many of the ideas that we had discussed way back then, that they're here. You can see that we do have this root here, and we do have the negative space underneath it. We have the foreground elements with the distinctive silhouettes and these mushrooms and these bushes. We have this support structure here, kind of holding up this giant piece of geo. We have the negative spaces up here, and you can't fully see it in the screenshot, but we also have the breakup over here where the stone section was made smaller, and then we have the wooden posts, and then we have the physical reactivity. And then also as an added bonus, you can see as well the effect stuff that we were talking about earlier. There's a light shaft over here. We can see the little glowing motes in the air, and then we can see the fireflies dancing in the foreground. So that gives it that extra little bit of polish. So you can kind of see how all of these ideas come together, and they can improve the scene. I'll take a look at another one. This one was from Windswept Waste. It was for the rotating laser room. And I remember this first pass because my first reaction to it was that the colors were getting a little too dark and murky, and that we were going to want to brighten things up a little bit. And then also for the laser at this time was in a broken state, but we don't have to focus on that too much. That happens during production. But I could tell that the color probably wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to be as pleasing to the eye. And then also for the actual hazards in the environment, they felt a little strange contextually, like they were just kind of tacked on. And so maybe we could tie these in better thematically to the environment. So this was a paint over that I had done based on those ideas. So you can see that the colors have been lifted. It's a lot brighter. The laser color has been changed. We're really going to play up more of these warm colors just to really play with that sense of heat in the desert. And then in terms of the hazardous surfaces, we've really recontextualized these into just scalding hot surfaces that are being created by the lasers. So the laser's going around, it's hitting these different things, and then basically making them so piping hot that they're dangerous to Ori. And that works a little bit better with the theme of the room relative to spikes. And then for these blockers themselves, the idea here was This is right before you reach the Windtorn Ruins. So let's start to tease the ruins and that architectural vibe by having these be buried parts of ruins, just to kind of give you that sense of something new is coming. And that's kind of those little twists that you throw to the player to get them excited to keep going. And here you can see the final set dressing, and I think the artist did a really great job. I think that it was looking much better, and when you play through it in the game, I think it plays really well. It's a little hard to see in the screenshot, but they also did include the architectural elements in these blocking pieces of geometry. All right, let's look at this one. This is for a spirit well. And I remember this first pass as well because, well, first of all, I think the camera was too low and we were seeing too much of this space down here. But in addition, it had a very boxy feel because the ground is very straight, the ceiling is very straight, and then this background wall here is also very straight. So this was a quick sketch over it, just trying to come up with ideas. How can we improve it? So let's break up the silhouette here and make something more organic. Let's also raise the camera so we don't see as much of this. Let's also add an alcove here, add a hole in the back, which creates a nice framing device around the spirit well. And for the ceiling, it doesn't actually have to be straight. We have a lot of liberty here. It's not relative to the gameplay, so we can make that more irregular. We can have an alcove up on the top. We can have a light ray coming down with little glowing motes for some effects. We can have foreground elements here with different roots and things framing the spirit well. And we can also have an accent color by playing off the complementary tones, having these dead leaves for an orange accent around the base of the spirit well. And all of these components are really meant to just draw your eye right here to the interactive that's important. Now, I remember this scene was being worked on and one of our artists had done a pass on it. So it was looking like this. And I think it really was coming together. It was looking a lot better. But if you're familiar with Blind Forest, you might be, or with Will of the Wisps, I should say, you might be looking at this and saying, I don't remember this spirit well in the game. I've played through Silent Woods. I don't remember this. And the truth is that you're right. This isn't in the game. But I included it because I think it's an interesting insight into that development process. Things are a moving target, like we talked about. So we were working on this, and then design came to us and said, you know what, we've thought about it, and we want to move this spirit well from here to the neighboring scene. So we basically took this, we chucked it out, and then we ended up adding the spirit well to the neighboring scene, which is this one, and this is the one that we ended up shipping with. But the really interesting thing about this is that the work that we did previously, that wasn't wasted work because that was just good practice for us. We were learning what works and what doesn't work. So here you can see, I actually wasn't involved with this spirit well really at all. The artist went in and they added this nice framing device around the spirit well. And they also played up the idea of the complementary accent colors here. It's almost an inversion of what I had suggested in the other scene, where I was saying blue scene, let's have orange accents. And so here they had an orange scene and they went with blue accents. So I remember when this was sent to me for review, I said, yeah, this looks good. And that's what we shipped with. So let's talk a little bit about reviewing. So basically what happened was we have hundreds of scenes in Ori. And for each of these scenes, I had this approximately 25-point checklist. And so I had this spreadsheet and it was linked to our bug tracking software. And this basically gave me a high level view of the project. And so I would go through and when someone would be assigned a scene, they would get 25 tasks. And when they would do all the set dressing and send it back to me for review, that would mean that they had gone through everything on the list, all of these reminders, and they had said, okay, I have address these in some capacity. That doesn't mean that they had to incorporate everything on the list. You don't have to, not every scene needs every single thing. That would probably be bad. But it's perfectly fine for an artist to say, for example, the checklist might say, can I, would animated light rays, would that improve my scene? It's perfectly fine for the artist to return the task to me as complete saying, I do not believe that animated light rays would improve this scene. And that's perfectly fine. That's a valid artistic opinion. That's a judgment call. And I might agree with them or not, and we can discuss with them if not. But that is that's extremely important because what it's saying is that we're not forgetting about anything. We are going through and doing our due diligence and saying, I believe that this wouldn't work. And it's a conscious decision instead of not. And so you might look at this and think, wow, this looks really monotonous to go through all of this stuff because in the end, this ends up being thousands and thousands of items to review. And the answer is that yes, to a degree, it was. It could be monotonous or repetitive in terms of a task. But what I found was that as a director, I really needed this kind of structure, and nobody was making me do this. This was something that I wanted to do because I felt like it was too easy for things to slip through the cracks if I didn't do this. So it was extremely useful to me, and it helped me stay on top of everything. Okay, so to kind of sum things up in terms of the art direction goals for the game, what I'd said before, an organized approach really avoids things falling through the cracks. And I think that that's really important. There's so many moving parts during development. It's very easy for things to fall through the cracks, and you don't want that to happen. Also, I think that having this approach of very, very specific feedback on every single component that a scene is made of, it's really useful because granular feedback can lead to actionable tasks, and it can help align the goals. So we might talk about the scene as a whole, and that's very important, and we should do that. But we can also zero in and focus on each individual piece. And the other good thing about that, and this kind of goes along with something that I think is important, is you never just want to focus on the negatives. I think that positives are equally important. So when we're looking at a scene, it's good to identify the things that can be improved and to say this can be better, and here's the actionable things that we can do to improve it. But also to take the time and to acknowledge all the things that are working really well, and to say, and this is great, and you're doing an awesome job on this. And that really gives people, I think, the confidence that we might not be all the way there yet, but we're going to get there. It's going to get better and better, and we're going to reach the end goal. And I think if the whole team believes that, then it's absolutely possible, and we are going to do it. So that's it for me. For direction. And I hope that it was interesting. I'm going to be handing things off now to my colleague, Daniel Van Leeuwen, and he's going to be showing you all the cool tech in the game. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and hello, everyone. My name is Daniel. I'm from the Netherlands, and I'm one of the lead artists at Moon Studios, and I was the lead technical artist on Ori and the Will of the Wisps. And I would like to show you guys how we achieved some of the effects for the art in Ori and the Will of the Wisps. I have a lot to show you guys, so let's jump right into it. So what do I want to go over with you guys? First, I want to show you a little bit how the world is set up, just very quickly to get an idea. Then how a scene is laid out in terms of layering and in terms of art. And then we're going to do a bit more of a deep dive into the Uber Shader framework and how it relates to dressing, lighting, and a little bit of animation just to top it off. All right, so most of you guys probably played Ori and the Will of the Wisps, so you'll notice that this is the complete layout of the production world, pretty much. This is in editor, but these are just little preview screenshots of all the scenes. So if we zoom in a little bit, you can see that this is a very tiled world in terms of how we work on it, and all of these tiles are defined as scenes. And these are just files in the production, and an artist would be working on one of these scenes, for example. Now, as the production went on, it's actually very simple to move these scenes around, and design would be making their little design layouts of different scenes, and they would try them out, and art would come in and dress them. But it was all a very organic workflow, so pretty far into the end of the production, we would still be making changes to a lot of things. And I can show you here a little view that is kind of cool, where I enabled all the scenes that were part of the production instead of just the stuff that went in game. And you can see just how much stuff is being iterated on and tried. And on the bottom right, you can see the little test scenes, the art test scenes that Jeremy was talking about. And this world just grew very organically, and we iterated a lot on it, and I thought it would just be interesting to show you guys this. So if we open one of these scenes, and you can see the scenes around it are still in screenshot mode, but this one is now open, and it's showing all the assets as they would be going in the final game. We're just a bit more zoomed out. So the camera would be closer in game, but here we can see the whole big scene. This is actually one of the bigger scenes in the game, and it gives you this really cool shoebox kind of insight. So one of the things that we really wanted to push on Ori and the Will of the Wisps was the depth of the scenes. Now, in Blind Forests, in general, the scenes weren't very deep. There were a few exceptions, like the Valley of the Wind. But here we wanted to take it just to a further level and across the whole game. So here you can see how deep these scenes actually go. Now, how are these set up in terms of layering? So over all the arts are pretty much just 6 layers. And here you can see me hover over those layers. And we had a few controls on these layers. So first of all, the depth of field. Here you can see me drag around these sliders that would adjust the depth of field. And depth of field is a very important effect for this type of game, because you want the player to focus on the center layer. And the center layer should be the sharpest point. And then all the other layers behind and in front of it, we could basically control per scene exactly how much blur they should be having. And this has allowed us a lot of control in terms of readability, because you know exactly where the player needs to focus, and it's very helpful. Now, one of the cool things as well is that these layers had a downsampling control. So because we are blurring the layers, you don't actually have that much information that you need to be going off from. So we can turn down the downsampling for each of these layers, and you can basically see that in the background it doesn't really have a big effect at all until I go to the very low values. But this was a really big benefit in terms of performance, because it allowed us to basically render all these backgrounds at a much lower resolution than the actual center layer and the stuff that mattered. Now, one of the things to note is that these layers are just definitions in space. They're not flat or anything. They're very predefined in terms of depth, and you can see the values on the right side here as well. Then in terms of arts, like, we're not bound to these layers. So here I have this scene and I rotate it 90 degrees, and you can see all the little flat elements, all the art pieces that make up this scene. And contrary to what some people think, we didn't actually use parallaxing layers or anything. All of the set dressing and all of the assets that were put in are just basically set dressed in a 3D space. And this allowed us to really push the parallaxing within certain elements, but also just across the whole scene. It gives a very 3D feeling, and I think it was pretty successful in the end. So one of the issues actually that came with pushing for this depth is that as you're moving around through the game, you can actually see right into the scenes around it. And one of the problems is that if you move around in the game, what you can see here is that the game would constantly be loading in these scenes just in and out of memory. One of the problems, of course, is that if you can see far into a neighboring scene, the assets would just pop and they would disappear suddenly, and it would look really strange. And we had a lot of these problems during the production. So one of the things that we used in order to counter this was background scenes. So here in this stretch of the start of the game, there is basically a giant background scene that contains all the distant art. So as you'd be moving through these scenes, the foreground scenes and the center layer that you'd be walking on would be disappearing as they get out of the frustrum, but just the art in the background would be staying active constantly. And because it's a lot less assets in the distance, this didn't require so much memory to actually load in. So that was just a little extra thing that we had to do in terms of getting this tiled world to work. Now, if we zoom in on this scene, and we take a little part of it, this big branch, the assets that we were using would be used very organically, and everything is hand-placed. Like, all the artists can do whatever they want with these assets. So one of these branches could actually contain like up to a few dozens of assets, just as much as we needed to get the final fidelity and the depth, and like even the little layering within this asset to make it really work. And this was also one of the things that we really improved in terms of Blind Forest, is we used a lot more assets compared to what was being used in there. And I think it shows. So if we take one of these assets out, you can actually see that we're only using part of it. We're masking out these assets with a tool, which is basically the backbone of the entire rendering system in Ori, and which is called Uber Shader. So let's go a bit into it. Now, Ubershader, on the left side, you can see all the modifiers. We call these modifiers, the little blocks. And Ubershader is applied to every asset in the game, and it allows artists to pick and choose exactly which modifiers they want to use. And these would be stackable. So it's just a very flexible shader system. We weren't bound to like some shader that had to do everything all the time. Artists, if they just had a simple asset and they just wanted to put a little tint on it, they wouldn't have to pick any of this. But the more complex and animating assets, like here, you would have a lot of stackable stuff. And I'm not going to go over all of these because we don't have the time for it. But I want to focus on 3 core pillars. And a lot of the modifiers, like some of the modifiers, actually carries pretty much all of the weight in game. So first of all, we're going to go a bit over the dressing and how we use the masking on the assets. Then the lighting, and how multiply is basically the backbone of all the lighting system in Ori. And then a bit of animation, so the turbulences and the distortions. All right, so dressing. What I showed you previously on the slide was this little asset that had a mask on it. And on the bottom, you can see a row of slides. And these are basically masks. We would have a pretty extensive library in the game of just different ways to mask out an asset. Now, the important thing to note here is that masking can be done on any modifier as well. So anything I'm going to show you in the next slides, always keep in the back of your mind that we always had the opportunity to put a mask on it. And these masks can be any scale, rotation, or hardness. And this is really the flexible nature of how we approach this. So if we take, in terms of dressing, just this little piece here, you can see on the left here is the piece isolated. And on the right are the assets that compose this piece. But you can see that the assets are painted in a way where, like, in some cases, you might not want all of the piece to actually make this cohesive thing that feels like it's one element. Like, we didn't want to have this feeling where all the assets really stuck out and you could see all the borders around all the assets. And that's just pretty ugly. Like, it needs to feel like a cohesive hand-painted game. And the masking really helped us to, like, specifically pick which part of an asset we wanted to use and to blend it in nicely and softly with the surrounding assets. Now, one of the things in Will of the Wisps is that we used a lot more assets than in Blind Forest. So something on the left here, we would actually put into something we call a kit. And we would have a browser for all of these kits. And these are predefined asset clumps. And they would already have all the masking and all the setups for the modifiers. So artists wouldn't have to, like, literally nitpick every single asset and adjust all these things. Although in many cases that definitely happened because these kits were basically constructed as we were dressing the scenes. So the first few scenes in any environment would just be all full handwork. And then as the library grew and grew, in some cases, the kits would also just grow with it and people would start using them. In other cases, like, it really depended on the artist. They would rather prefer to just do everything manual because that just gives you a lot more control in the end. And, like, fiddling with these kits was, in some cases, more work than just doing it from scratch. So here you can see actually someone dressing a scene, our talented artist Florian, who is doing a watermill scene. And you can see how quickly he blocked in the background with a few of these kits. But then as he goes into the center layer, you can see he starts really placing these individual elements because the center layer is this black trace from design. And we really need to match it exactly in terms of to make the gameplay work. Like the jump that Ori can take, it's all predefined in this design blockouts. And to dress the center layer in a way where it fits perfectly with the blockout, we actually had to manually place all these assets one by one. You can find this video on YouTube as well if you want to see the whole dressing. Then that's basically the basis of how a scene is dressed and how we approached it with these assets. Now let's go a bit into the lighting and atmosphere because that's one of the really important elements of Ori. There's a few things that make up a scene. So first of all, we have base tinting, which I'll show you in a bit. Then we go into the fogs, which actually have a tremendous amount of effect on the scene and how you perceive it. And this would be a distance fog and local fogs. Then in terms of lighting, we had 3 different types of lighting. We have static lighting, we have dynamic lighting, and we have lighting on the 3D characters, which had to fit into the environment. And then last, we have a bit of post light variation and post settings, but I won't really go into that. All right, so base tint. So this is a view of a scene without anything on top of it, like no lighting, nothing, no modifiers, no Ubershader. And you can just see how big of a mess it is. Now, one of the things here is that these assets would basically be made for different environments. Like Jeremy was showing you on the Winter Forest, we would be making assets for the Winter Forest. But as the project grew, some of these assets from the Winter Forest, like some artists might use them in the desert, just as an extreme example. But of course, the base tinting of these assets, because they were painted for a particular environment, wouldn't fit into another environment. So here you can see just a mismatch of tints and different values across these assets. So one of the first things that we did was put a tint on it. And this is actually an example of some assets, like from the swamp, from Quolok's Hollow, and from Swallow's Nest. And you can see how much of a value difference there is within these. And what artists would basically do is just, we'd have a little multiplier color, and they would go on top of the assets, and they could control the value and the color. And if we apply that on top of this, you can see that a lot of the assets actually come close together in this bit of a green vibe. And especially on the top here, you can see like those red hanging things on the rock. When the tint is applied, it actually starts matching a little bit better already. Now, this isn't the way that it would be dressed, to be very clear. Like, this is just a preview of, okay, what does the effect do? The dressing would be much more dynamic, where artists would intermingle all these kinds of things, and this tint apply would basically happen as we'd be going and as we'd be lighting stuff, just to make sure that the assets kind of fit together in terms of that space. Then a very important thing, fogs. Now, this is one of the biggest things, one of the stuff that really helps with the art direction of Ori. And here you can see the scene, which already had the tints applied, and I just applied this linear distance fog. And it's already a whole step up from what it was, like much more readable. And in Ori, we always had this thing where we wanted the scintillate to stick out from the background. So in a lot of cases, this fog would not be as effective on the center, but it would have different colors in the background. So maybe your background would be orange and your scintillate would be green, and vice versa. Like you can see here at the bottom. So these very big color spaces are basically being defined by this fog gradient. And we had a little control for it. Within the center is basically your center layer, and then on the left you have your foreground, and on the right you have your background. And we could place any of these color tints and alpha tints anywhere we wanted. So in the middle, you can see like all the little presets that we had. And these presets could just very quickly be put on the scene, just to check which one might work. And then an artist would go in and adjust these very specific color things. And the cool thing is that we can use any color across the distance. So if you wanted a bit of different hue shift or just a completely different effect across the depth, we could achieve it with this. So here you can see me just apply a few of these presets very quickly. Now, most of these won't work great because the scene wasn't built for it. But I guess it's just interesting to show you guys like what type of effect these would give. Then a more important thing is also the local fogs. Now, this is basically just simple assets. Like any other assets, they'd just be soft glows and clouds and all that kind of stuff. And you can see how much this does. Like, this allowed artists to place these fogs specifically where they wanted and even animate them a little bit. And this really helped us to push and pull all the various things that we wanted in the scene. So if we take that scene that I'm referring to again and again, and we apply the local fog on top, you can see actually we're getting pretty close already to something that resembles an Ori scene. Then lighting. So first of all, static lighting. The backbone of all the lighting in Ori is the multiply modifier. And on the left, you can basically see this tinting thing that I was talking about, which just tints the whole thing. And we could put a bit of HDR intensity on the multiply, and we could have different colors. And then on the right is the actual multiply modifier. And this also had a mask input. So you can see that there's a little bit of a linear mask, and the bottom would get black and the top would get colored. And this is just pretty much like the backbone of all the lighting, especially in Blind Forest. In Blind Forest, every asset was lit like this. So here you can see a linear gradient, and it would be applied on top of this thing. And every asset would be lit like this. So basically the artists have to go in and just light asset per asset per asset, and tweak the colors and the intensity and the mask in terms to get the actual look of the game. And if I just turn it off on one of these old Blind Forest scenes, you can kind of see how it all works. And this would already be like dozens of assets, all with their individual multiply modifiers and linear masks. But you can see how much it helps. Like it really puts the focus on where you want to play. And that was the important thing. Now, like I mentioned before, Ori and the Will of the Wisps just has a lot more assets going into it. And at the start of the production, we actually did do the same thing as Blind Forest, where the artist would have to put multipliers on each of these assets. But as we soon figured out, like this was just not doable in terms of speed of production and all this kind of thing. So here you can see something we developed for Will of the Wisp, which was light canvases. And now these could be put on any group of assets that an artist wanted. And these light canvases are basically textures that get multiplied on top of a whole group of assets. So here you can see the top was being painted a bit yellow and the bottom was painted black. And this really helps with the readability. Now, you could basically just go in and basically paint wherever you wanted and whatever color you wanted. So you could tweak the color as well on these things that got multiplied. And we would basically have 3 layers. So the first layer would be for the light. Then the second layer here would be for the shadow. So we could also paint the shadows. And the third layer would actually be to mask out dynamic light, which I'll show you in a bit. So as you can see here, this dressing progress video, the artists, once they had some base layout of the assets, they would go in and they would define these groups and they would put on these light canvases and just start painting where they wanted. And you can see here that like these canvases would be put on small little groups everywhere. And we'd basically have many of them throughout the scene. So here's Swallow's Nest, for example, at the start of the game. There's just all of these little yellow tiles are light canvases. And there's also a big light canvas across the entire scene and another light canvas for 3D characters as well, which would also be receiving this type of lighting. But yeah, this technique just really sped up the process in terms of dressing and lighting and just flexibility. Like you could move an asset within one of these canvases and it would still grab this global light that would be going on top of it. So if we go back to this pre-scene again that I was showing, we have this base with just the fogs and the local fogs, and then we bring in this multiply and light canvases. And this is basically how a lot of the lighting in Blind Forest was achieved, or how the look in Blind Forest was achieved. So now we basically have our game, but it's all very static, right? So if we take a little bit of a recap, we have the static lighting, then the tinting, then we have the distance fog, then we put on the local fogs, and then the final light canvas go on. So if we compare the before and after, you can see actually how much of an effect just all of the lighting passes have. Now, on Will of the Wisps, we really wanted a dynamic light as well. Like there was a little bit of it in Blind Forest, but it was just basically these multiply masks that would scroll over the scene. But here we wanted to define a bit more of the shapes on all the assets. So that brings us to the dynamic lighting. Now here, for example, you can see Ori picks up a little torch, and the torch has an effect on all the assets, and the assets feel dimensional. Like they have a little bit of a rim from the red, and even Ori itself, of course, is a very big light source, which would constantly be lighting up the environment around him. Then we could also use these point lights for dressing. So, for example, this scene switches between night and day, and this sunlight is just dynamically applied. And again, like all these lights as well, they could just have these masks that would scroll over and animate everything, and it would just give the scene a lot of dimensionality and liveliness and all this kind of stuff. Here another example of what it does when we place these dynamic lights. Like this structure had to be destructed, or had to be broken down by Shriek. And we could have just painted one of these like static canvases, but the problem is, of course, if that these bones fly around, that will just look weird, like it's just scrolling this projected texture on top of it. So that's also one of the reasons why we really needed and wanted these dynamic lights, so we could have a lot more interactivity in the world and all these physical setups and all that kind of stuff. Another thing that was a great use for this was effects. So one of these mosaics in the game, you can see we had these little twinkling lights on top of it, and it would catch this thing as you placed it and moved it around. So how are these actually built? For every asset in the scene, we would basically be painting 6 of these light maps. So one for each side, and then one from the front and one from the back. And we tried various techniques to achieve these, but in the end, like all the auto-generated stuff didn't really work for us. It didn't give us the hand-painted look that we wanted. So we resorted to just painting all of these by hand. And now you have to consider that there's a few thousand assets in the scene. And this would jokingly be a task for artists as a kind of punishment, or like a lot of the artists really hated doing these kind of things. So we try to spread it out across the art team as much as possible. And we also got a bit of help from an outsourcing studio to paint these 6 light maps for a few thousand assets. So there's probably around 30,000 of these light maps in the entire project to light everything. So here you can see the process of painting these. So we'd be lassoing apart, then we basically have a Photoshop action that would allow the artist to at least get a quick base, and then we define the specific elements that we wanted to push and pull in Photoshop. Now, once that's all applied on all the assets, you can actually see like how much depth this gives. And we had these point lights, and then a special bit of math that would blend all these various sides together in a kind of fluid way. And it really brings out a different dimension across the assets. So if we go back to this preview scene that I was showing, if we move Ori around it, you can actually see like all these little mushrooms pick up the light, and everything starts to feel much more dynamic and volumetric compared to what we previously had. This, of course, also had a big help on the day and night state. So there's a few parts in the game that actually flip states at, like, for example, the start where the scene goes from night to day. And this would basically be a static flip, like we didn't have a dynamic slider or anything. So it happens during a cinematic. But what we basically do is we enable and disable all these different light canvases, global fog, local fogs, asset groups like for the sun, point lights, and just post setting as well, which in our case is just a bit of bloom and color correction in most cases. So that brings us to the 3D lighting. So we had a lot of big monsters in this game, and they had to fit our assets very nicely. So we wanted to achieve a bit of this like light painted look that we get from our point light assets, but then on 3D characters. So how did we do this? The big important thing is we used different types of normals on the meshes. So this is something that's used in games a lot, where for vegetation, you can make a clump of leaves just feel more rounded and nicely shaded, instead of all these little polygons being stuck out and caught by the lighting. So here you can see Shriek's legs and body. Like on the right side is the final in-game mesh, and on the left side is the actual mesh with just normal normals. And this blends together all the little fine elements on him. But then another thing was something we developed, which is called offset maps. So the offset maps break up the light from all of these point lights, and they pick up a bit of this hand-painted information. Like, of course, the hand-painted base texture is extremely important, and our artists really did a great job on painting these characters in terms, so they would already fit pretty much. But then this lighting, it would just help to kind of break up this feeling that you'd usually get from just placing a point light. And this would tie hand in hand with the normal thing I showed. So these adjustments could be made per light. So you could adjust the offset, which would basically drag it across the mesh, like it wouldn't be realistic. And then you could tweak the hardness. And because we could do this on every point light and place all these point lights by hand, like the character artist had a lot of control on how to exactly light these characters so they fit in perfectly. And here you can see, if I turn it on and off, like what the lights are actually doing on this guy. That brings us to environment animation, which I'll just quickly go over. So we have 3 types: a turbulence scale, which scales the assets and which can also be masked; a turbulence rotation, which can also be masked, and it's just, the turbulence is just a little bit of variation across the assets. And then turbulence translation. So this is just moving assets, and this can be used for floating objects, for example. Then meshes. Like the textures you see in game are basically textures, but they are meshes. So in a lot of cases, we would drag and paint these different types of geometry, so we could animate them. And on the vertices, we could put in some different time values and just get this very fluid animation. And here you can see, if we stack rotation and scale, this gives a bit of bounciness and liveliness to these assets. And here we stack all 3, so just a lot of liveliness and position, and it just gives a lot more dimensionality to all these static objects. Then another thing, distort, which was basically normal maps that we could put on and they would scroll, and this is basically the backbone of pretty much all of the effects in Ori. Like distort really carried 80% of all the work here. You can see how much it does in this little cloud, for example. So just something to show you just the stacking power of this Uber shader framework. This little plant, which we had in the game, which pushed out water, we would animate it. So first some turbulence scale on top of it with this mask that would be scrolling. Then we'd put on the distort, which would basically randomize a bit of the movement. Then some turbulence rotation on all these little extra poles that have these bubbles coming out. And then a bit of extra distort on the tops, so it would break up a bit more of how it's moving and just give this liveliness. So yeah, if we bring it all together, you can basically see here this teaser trailer that we put together at the start, and all the animation, all the lighting, all the static lighting, the little character lights, and just all these little simple steps that stack up with this Uber shader system allows us to create these very vibrant and interesting environments for Ori. So yeah, recap. The basics are pretty simple. It's just a lot of manual work. And then the power of stacking those simple things, like I just mentioned, will give us this look. This type of production is probably not suited for all teams and games projects. It does give the artists a very, very good control over exactly what they want to achieve, but it's not a system that can easily scale across a very big open world, for example. But for Ori, it was perfect for what we wanted to achieve. And yeah, that's it. Thank you, and have a good day.